Today I will be interviewing you on why DNA is more reliable than eyewitness testimony.
Okay.
Our first question is, what type of procedures are used to collect DNA evidence?
DNA is usually collected in one of a couple of ways, depending on the type of evidence that's being collected. If it's a fluid type evidence, then it's usually collected through a cotton swab, and then that swab is secured in a tube, and it's kept in a secure location until it's processed through our property control section and then sent to the lab for analysis. Other DNA can be done through, like if we're taking a sample from a person, then we use a type of a brush that looks almost like a small bristle toothbrush. They scrub the inside of the person's cheek to get the cells off of that, and that goes into an envelope as well. Any DNA sample that is collected has to be maintained individually, separate and apart from any other DNA sample that's collected. That way, that ensures the integrity of that individual DNA sample. But usually, we refer to them as swabbings, and that would be the cotton swabbing or the cheek scrub. Those are the two main ways that DNA is collected. Out of some dried evidence, then that dried evidence may be collected, dried blood type thing, that may be collected. Hairs can be collected for DNA through the root balls of the hair. So there's a number of different ways DNA can be collected, but the primary ways that are done in the field are through swabbings, through like a Q-tip type of swab, or through the cheek scrub. Okay, sure.
Are there different methods into collecting eyewitness testimonies?
Well, generally it's an interview of some type. When you're interviewing an eyewitness, the way that is preferred to do it with a person who is a key eyewitness to your event is to bring them into a relaxed setting in an interview room, and that interview is recorded, okay, both video and audio. So you've got a good record of that interview. That's not always available to people. Some people, being an eyewitness, you cannot compel them to come downtown to give a statement. You can't, it's like you see on the TV shows, oh, we need to go downtown and talk about this. We can't do that. If a person is an eyewitness, they cannot be compelled to go anywhere with us. We ask them to come down and give a statement. Sometimes they may not be able to. Maybe there's child care issues. Maybe they have other things they have to attend to. So then you're relying upon an interview in the field. And that can be done, over the years it's been done a number of ways, where you would have the person write out what they saw, and then you would review it with them and they would sign it. I never liked that, because if you hand somebody a piece of paper and say, tell me what you saw, how can you ask them questions and clarify and get better detail? Preferred way is to have the investigating officer interview that person and write down what that person is telling them, and then have that person review it and then sign it attesting that this is a true and accurate statement as to the accounts that they recall. With today's technology, we have cameras in our cars. We can interview somebody in the car with the camera and audio that way. But again, it's all dependent on the type of situation.
Okay. Can you explain why different eyewitnesses may see the same event but see it differently?
Well, a number of different ways. They have a different point of view, meaning they saw it from a different angle. Okay. They may not have seen what the suspect had in their hands because they could not see the suspect's hands. Their attention may have been drawn to one thing rather than the entirety of the circumstance. They may have seen, let's give an example of, say, a shooting offense. They may have seen the person pull and fire a weapon, but they didn't see what the other person may have had in their hands that may have precipitated that. They may have reacted to a sound and turned and looked rather than seeing the whole event. The angle they saw it at can be the impact of the event. It's something that they've never seen before, and the fact that they could be scared could impact what they saw. And of course, personal bias. Personal bias plays a role sometimes into how people perceive events. There have been studies where a professional-looking person and a person who looked like they lived on the streets are put out and involved in a situation, and people would tend to steer towards the professional-looking person as the victim rather than the aggressor, where it may actually have been scripted the other way around, but their personal bias said, well, that person couldn't have started it. So there's those instances as well, but it comes down to perspective, angle, ability, and perception, what they were able to see and what they were able to process.
Okay. Would their personal bias be based off of like their feelings toward the other person?
It could be. It could be. It could be racial. It could be gender. It could be socioeconomic. It could be ethnic. It could be any number of things. It could just be what they expected to see based on the situation. And a lot of times what you expect to see isn't what you actually see.
How are both DNA and the eyewitness testimony presented in court?
The eyewitness testimony, we would have the person themselves actually testify, because there are very few cases where we can present the eyewitness testimony of someone without them being there, and that would be in the case of that person has died. That's about the only example you can give where they're physically not able to provide that testimony. If you can't provide a person to the court to testify to what was presented in the case file, you can't consider it. DNA testimony is generally presented through a sequence of events. It'll follow the investigating officer who observed the evidence on the scene, to the crime scene technician who collected the evidence on the scene, to the DNA analyst who actually processed the DNA and is able to give you a report on what that DNA told. So it's not one person who is able to testify to that DNA evidence. It takes that whole chain. It's called a chain of custody. So that you're able to preserve the integrity of what was actually collected on the scene is what was tested in the lab, and you have the people available to testify to it, and you have the paper chain of custody to show that it's been able to go through that without contamination.
When presenting an eyewitness testimony, would any special circumstances be granted, like, say, the eyewitness protection agency?
Not usually.
Okay.
There may be special cases where you have a small child involved, but a defendant has the right to face their accusers in court. So it's rare that that would ever happen, because you have to be able to cross-examine. The defense has to be able to, they have the right to question that eyewitness as well.
Okay. How can they both be corrupted?
Eyewitness testimony, again, can be corrupted through misperceptions, can be corrupted through bias, can be corrupted over conversation among other people. One of the primary things that officers on the scene have to do when there are a number of witnesses is you have to separate them, because as soon as they start talking to each other, then what I saw and what you saw may get confused. You may have seen something that I didn't see, but when you tell me about it, then it becomes part of my story. But that's not actually what you saw. You can't testify to it. So you separate them, and you don't give them the opportunity to talk to each other about the offense, because you want each person's individual account. Again, they can be corrupted through bias, can be corrupted through misperception, can be corrupted over time. People tend to forget what they saw, or can even change in their mind what they've seen. DNA is harder to corrupt if it is handled and packaged properly. That's why you have a very set process, a chain of custody, procedures on how that is collected, how it is kept separate and apart from other items of evidence, how each item is packaged, recorded, stored, how it's transferred from the collecting technician to the property section for storage, how it's taken from property to the lab. Everything is signed for, everything is recorded, so you have a strong chain of custody. Where it gets corrupted is generally, and it's rare, is where people make mistakes in the field. and they confuse samples. But that's rare.
Okay. Can you give an example where a case has been corrupted by either time or anything like that?
I cannot off the top of my head. I'm trying to think locally, I'm trying to think nationally. You know, there's a, if you paid attention to the newspaper, you got the Jeffrey McDonald case. He was a doctor back in the 70s in the military. He was accused of killing his wife, and he was sentenced to prison. And ever since then, he's been fighting the case with different stories, and they're trying to rely on accounts of people that are dead, that supposedly changed their stories after the trial. So that's one that they're having to try and sort out through appeals. There's some cases, let's see, the cases tend to get corrupted through a rush to judgment, where there's a presumption of guilt because of the first information that comes out, and then you have a guided prosecution to try and fit that presumption of guilt. And that's why you have to rely on what the evidence tells you, and let the evidence be your guide rather than what you think. We tell people in our lab are civilians, they're not police officers. I'm the only police officer up there.
Oh.
They're civilians, they're scientists, and they don't know the specifics of the case. All they're looking to do is, particularly in DNA, can I identify this? Can I pull a strand of DNA out here and match it in the system or match it to this or that? They don't know who the suspect is. They don't know who the victim is for the most part. They are to follow the science. You know, let the science tell them where things are. The Duke Lacrosse case was a bad case of where there was a rush to judgment that there was guilt, and that was a case where a woman claimed she was raped by a lacrosse team at a party, and everybody rushed to judgment on that, and there were probably some bad things that happened there, but as the more detail came out, probably wasn't what she assumed, and they were charging these college kids with rape, and they eventually had to dismiss all those cases, and because her credibility was not good, but there was a rush to judgment. In fact, I think a year after that, she was convicted of attempted murder for setting her boyfriend on fire. So, yeah, there's usually when I tell people, when you see something on the news, there's usually more to it. Yeah, and that's, police can't talk about a lot of their evidence on the front end because we don't know what that evidence tells us yet until we get a chance to really go through it. Okay.
How can DNA evidence and eyewitness testimony work for and against each other?
When they don't match up, is when they work against each other. Is when a person gives a description of a suspect, and that person is arrested based on that description, and the DNA that's recovered, that's taken from that person does not match the DNA at scene. That can work against you because you've got somebody who says, well, that's the person I saw run from the robbery, or that's the person that robbed me. And then you say you recover items from the robbery that have the suspect's DNA on, but they don't match the person that was identified. That works against you. So where do you go? Do you go with the eyewitness testimony or do you go with the DNA? You have to go with where the science tells you. And you would assume that you will usually find you going back and re-interviewing that person when they say, yeah, that's the person who robbed me, and then when you talk to them further, it's, well, I was pretty sure it was the person who robbed me. Pretty sure doesn't work. For an eyewitness identification, it has to be that person. And sometimes people get apprehensive, one, to say it's that person because they don't want to be put on that spot, or they so badly want it to be that person that they may identify the wrong person.
Okay, that is all of our questions that I have today. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Good? Alrighty.